All right, good afternoon, everybody. I got a lot of material here, so I'm going to get started. When I was a younger grower, trying to learn how to make plants happy, I didn't have a lot of resources like we have today. I didn't have the internet. We had a couple books out there. We had the Grower's Bible, Rosenthal, and Jorge Cervantes, but there was not a lot of resources to learn besides going to college. So I knew what nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, I knew what they were because they're listed on every bottle of nutrients you ever buy. I know nitrogen was good for green growth, your vegetative. I knew you need phosphorus for your roots and stems and for big buds. And I know you need potassium for, I never really knew what you needed potassium for. I didn't have any idea, but I wanted to. I always wanted to know what the molecules were that I was feeding the plant, how it was taking them, what it was turning them into, how it was using them, how it was benefiting the plant, and how I could do that better to make the plant happier. So that's what I'm going to talk about a lot today. And talking about the plant, the first thing is the cell. The cell is what the plant is. It's a collection of cells. Everyone's doing its job. And the plant and the cell is a really amazing thing. Any plant can take 14 nutrients and 3 elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, that it gets from the environment, and it can turn those 17 things into literally thousands of different molecular combinations that it needs for enzymes, proteins, for signaling, for moving nutrients, for making sugar, for everything the plant has to do. So the cell itself, to me, when you look at it closely, is like an animal in itself. It's got a bunch of organs inside, or organelles they call them, because they're microscopic. But each one of them has a specific job, and it's carrying out its functions independent, just like organs in our body. And all these organelles inside the cell, they have tiny tubules that connect them, just like veins in our circulatory system, so that the different apparatus of the cell can move nutrients, proteins, etc., around through the cell and into neighboring cells. Can anybody tell me what the main or most noticeable difference is between animal cells and plant cells? You got a good one. I was thinking of the cell wall. Cell wall is really obvious when we look at the cell. Plants have a thick cell wall that's mainly made out of cellulose, but it's porous. Sorry, let me move along here before I get too far. These are the things I'm going to go over through today's session. Parts of the cell, how they work, what their functions are. Water and nutrient, what the plant's systems are to distribute water and nutrients throughout the plant. Ionic charges, what they are, why they're important, how the plant uses them. The vascular system, which ties in with water and nutrient movement, but we'll go a little bit more specific into it. And then at the end, nutrient allocation, what the nutrients are you're giving your plant, where they're ending up, what their functions are. So talking about cellular components, the cell wall, porous, strong, built out of cellulose. This is like fiber, what we think of as fiber, like a paper bag basically is cellulose. And it's porous. I think of it like the Scotch-Brite, the scrubby part of your kitchen sponge is essentially what the cell wall looks like. It's a bunch of tiny fibers woven together in a pattern that makes them extremely strong, but it leaves them porous so the water and nutrients can move right into it, no problem. The next step past the cell wall, so cell wall is easily penetrable by everything. Looking at your roots down in the soil, you got water that assimilates nutrients and washes it towards the roots. That water can run right into the cell wall and essentially penetrate the root. The next layer that comes after the cell wall is called the plasmolemma. And plasmolemma is made out of plasma, like it sounds like. It's a double layered membrane. So on the inside, it's really thick, like wax, and basically nothing can penetrate it. But on both walls, on the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell, it attracts water. So basically, it's this membrane that wants water and nutrients to come up to it, but it wants to stop any of them from entering the cell unless it moves it across the cell wall with its own motivation. So the plasmolemma it makes up the cell. If it wasn't there, the cell wouldn't be able to hold all the things that are inside of it. The cell wouldn't be able to control its pH. Plasmolemma is the guard dog at the outside of the cell. It's the wall. And we'll talk, there's functions of the plasmolemma, how it moves nutrients across it into the cell, and we'll talk about that later. Once you get past the plasmolemma, the whole cell is full of cytoplasm, is the jelly-like stuff that all of the organs in the cell kind of float around in. We have a tendency to think of the cell as being really empty and just full of this cytoplasm and then a few things here and there doing functions, but that's not the way it is at all. The cell is completely full of molecules of different organelles that are performing different jobs. But when we look at a cell diagram, like I'm going to show you guys here in a minute, the cell looks really empty because it's just easier to interpret the visual demonstration of it that way. The nucleus, the most important part of the cell. Nucleus is large, not the largest part of the cell. The vacuole usually is, but the nucleus contains all of the DNA of the cell. And the nucleus is basically the brain. It's responsible for sending out the signals to every other part of the cell that tell the cell how to build itself, how to control nutrient movement, what compounds it needs, et cetera, et cetera. And then the vacuole is basically just a storage space. But the vacuole is really important because it controls the pressure inside the cell. There's two things, essentially, that give plants the strength to stand up and move and exist in the shape that they do without a skeletal system or any muscles. They'd just be laying on the ground flat if they didn't have a cell wall and internal cell pressure, or turgor is what we call that. So the vacuole is responsible for sequestering all kinds of things inside the cell, whether it be nitrogen or lipids or starches or toxins or just water and hydrogen ions to keep the pressure in the cell increased. So that vacuole gets bigger and increases the pressure inside the cell. That pushes out on the cell walls and keeps them nice and rigid so the plant can stand up. Now here's that picture of the cell. And there's some other parts on there too we're going to talk about in a second. But this green representation out here is the cell wall. And these odd-shaped ones are the neighboring cell walls of other cells. And then just this little brown piece we have that you can see right here, that's the plasmolemma, the plasma lining that actually keeps everything inside, because the cell wall out here is porous. If it wasn't for the plasmolemma, everything would just pour out of the cell. So other important components of the cell, I'm going to go through these kind of quick. The mitochondria is the powerhouse. It converts sugar into ATP, which is essentially the energy molecule that the cell uses. Golgi apparatus is responsible for labeling and delivering important enzymes around through the cell. Ribosomes, those are your protein creation centers. Now, proteins, arguably one of the most important parts of the cell. You'll hear me talk about enzymes and proteins and amino acids. Amino acids are parts of proteins. Aminos get assembled into proteins. And the plant uses proteins as enzymes lots of times, or as signaling molecules. So essentially, when you talk about an enzyme, or excuse me, when you talk about an amino acid, you're talking about the basis of a protein, you're talking about an enzyme, you're talking about all of the things that the cell needs to communicate with itself, really. So ribosomes are largely found in the endoplasmic reticulum. That's where majority of the proteins are created, and then the endoplasmic reticulum is responsible for kind of sorting them out and making sure they go to the right part of the cell, labeling them. And then the endoplasmic reticulum also makes lipids, which are fats, which is essentially what the cell membrane is made out of, that plasma membrane. Chloroplast, that's one I hope you all know. Chloroplasts make chlorophyll. It's the organelle inside the cell that gets radiation and converts that CO2 into sugar. And then peroxisomes, they're peroxisomes, they convert lipids back into sugars. So basically fats that break off or whatever they're floating around in the cell, peroxisomes can take those fats, convert them back into sugars. So then the mitochondria can take those sugars, convert them into ATP, which again is your energy molecule for the plant. So when water and nutrients want to make their way through the plant, they got to start at the root. Generally, the plant's best system starts at the root. Diffusion and osmosis are the two mechanisms that will basically allow or cause nutrients and water to move without the plant's input. The plant has a lot of mechanisms that are going to move molecules around through the cell, in or out. But diffusion and osmosis are movements that are caused by areas of concentration. So if you have more molecules in one area, they want to diffuse out to an area that has less molecules. That's basically all it's saying. And then osmosis is the same thing with water. Water wants to move across a membrane if there's a lower concentration of water on the other side or a higher concentration of molecules. So basically it's everything trying to balance itself out. Imagine if you take a glass of water and you drop a drop of red food coloring in there. It's going to start out as a drop, but after a few minutes, it's going to fill that whole glass with red, and that's diffusion. So that's important for plants because that's how nutrients move in the soil towards the roots, and it's how they move in all of the plant's juices, if you will, to get to where they need to be without the plant's input. So besides diffusion and osmosis, there's 3 different techniques that water and nutrients can use to move through the cells. That's the direct pathway, the apoplastic pathway, and the symplastic pathway. Now, the direct pathway, that's just for water. Water is a very specialized molecule because of its 2 hydrogens. It carries a charge, and it's a very small molecule, allows it to go anywhere it wants in the cell. Water can pass easily through the cell wall. It can pass through any of the organelles inside the cell. It passes through the cytoplasm. It'll pass right through the other cell wall into the next cell, no problem. Obviously, water is the most important thing for the plant. It can't do anything else without water. It has to be able to get as much as it can through all of the cells whenever it wants to. So water's like, I'll do whatever I want. It goes wherever it wants. The apoplastic pathway, we see that PLAS in there, like in the plasmalemma. These 2 words, apoplastic and symplastic, they're just basically saying this is outside the plasmalemma and this is through the plasmalemma. So water and nutrients can move into that porous cell wall that's made out of cellulose, and they can cruise right through it and hit the cell wall of the next cell and the next cell and the next cell, never have to penetrate the cell and just move through this porous layer in between them. But it's the root's job to stop all of that random water and nutrient. It could be toxins, it could be sodium, it could be things that the plant doesn't want that are in that water. So when water and nutrients move through that cell wall, they hit the Casparian strip. And I'm going to show you guys a picture here in a minute what the Casparian strip looks like. But basically it's lipids that the cells create, fats that are not water soluble, right? And the cells deposit those lipids into the cell wall and fill up that cellulose so that the water has to stop. And it can only pass through so many cells before it gets close to that center of the root where the root has to protect itself from anything coming in there. So at the Casparian strip, anything that wants to continue moving through the plant towards the vascular system has to pass through the symplastic pathway, through the cell membrane and into the cell. So symplastic modes of transport, there's a couple main ones. The Plasmodesmata is, they're tiny openings in the cell wall, not the cell wall, excuse me, the cell membrane. So when 2 cells divide, there's a piece of the cell wall that gets pinched, and it creates basically a tube, a straw, that passes between the first cell and the second cell. So every cell is connected by these very, very small open tubes. So once something's inside the cell, if it's small enough, it can use the Plasmodesmata to move from one cell to the next, to the next, to the next, to go from the root all the way to the top of the plant, no problem. The Plasmodesmata are regulated by proteins. Again, proteins regulate and control almost everything inside the cell. Proteins close down the Plasmodesmata to the size that they want them to be, and that's controlled by the cell. So that's the cell's method of making sure molecules are small enough to pass from cell to cell without hurting it. And the other main symplastic pathways are called integral membrane proteins down in the bottom, or IMPs. There's a bunch of different kinds of integral membrane proteins. Again, proteins. These are proteins that are embedded in the plasma cell membrane that are able to transfer nutrients from outside the cell to inside the cell. And the main protein, is called channel protein, and there are several specific channel proteins on the cell membrane. Basically, a channel protein is an unregulated entry through the cell membrane, but it is shaped very specifically to match the molecule that it's going to allow to pass through. So only the molecule that that specific channel is shaped for is going to be able to pass through there. That's how the plant meters these channels, and it's the most efficient way. So the most important things for the cell are going to use these channel membranes, or channel proteins, and they will fly through. Okay, channel proteins are able to transfer up to 100 million molecules a second. That is a lot of reactions going on inside the cell. The other IMPs are transfer proteins, which are they're not an open hole through the cell membrane. They're a protein that's embedded through the membrane, and it's able to bond with a molecule on one side and therefore bring it through the cell wall and introduce it to the other side on the inside of the cell. And those are all, so the channel proteins or the transfer proteins, neither of those require energy from the plant. They're just use diffusion and osmosis. The desire of the molecules to move through the cell wall is all that it needs. The last one is called a protein pump, and this is one that does take energy. So the protein pumps are important because they are the cell's only real mechanism to get rid of things that don't want to go away or to bring in things that don't want to come in. And so the cell has to expend energy to use those protein pumps. Energy is ATP, which comes from sugar, which comes from photosynthesis. So the plant has to make sugar, has to convert it to energy molecule, has to burn that energy molecule to force those protein pumps to push the molecules that it doesn't want out of the cell or to bring them into the cell, depending on what it is. I got the picture of the cell here again for you because I wanted to show you these are the Plasmodesmata down here, even though it doesn't label them. So just a channel that moves directly into the next cell, straight through the wall. And then like the endoplasmic reticulum, which is responsible for a lot of the protein production and delivering proteins throughout the cell, has tubules that connect directly to those Plasmodesmata. So the cell can decide just to straight ship proteins right to the next cell if it wants to. The key point here is that these pathways allow the cells to transfer nutrients, and it's going to vary. How many Plasmodesmata are there and what they do is going to depend a whole lot on what kind of plant cell you're talking about. Because if it's a leaf cell that's main job is to photosynthesize and produce sugar, it's going to have a whole lot more pathways on the cell membrane to get sugar out of that cell and move it back into the plant, into other cells where they're going to be burning sugar rather than producing it. On the other hand, a cell lower down in the plant, like in the root, is going to have a whole lot of connections that are based on moving water up the plant rather than moving sugar down the plant. Now here's a diagram that shows the apoplastic and symplastic pathway. You see up above, the red line shows the apoplastic pathway, where water and nutrients move into that porous cell wall. And they can move through a couple of cells until they hit that purple waxy layer. That's the Casparian strip. At that point, water can't just flow through cells anymore. It has to pass through the cell membrane, through the symplastic pathway, either through a transfer protein or through one of the 3 transfer proteins, basically. And then you can, this diagram also shows the Plasmodesmata for the symplastic pathway there in green. So it moves directly into the cell, moves through a Plasmodesmata into the next cell. And then they're all moving towards those the cells with the blue interior, which are vascular cells. That's going to be the xylem, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Okay, so nutrients that you're feeding your plant, hopefully, are ionic. There's a big difference here whether you're using an organic nutrient or if you're using a salt-based nutrient. Essentially what salt-based nutrients are, dissolvable nutrients, they're powdered or maybe liquid. You just pour them into the water and they dissolve completely. Those are ions. They're salts that are turning into their ionic form as soon as you put it into water. As soon as you pour that water across the root, those ions are available to pass across the cell membrane. So basically what an ion is the simplest form of a molecule that we're going to find in nature that has a positive or negative charge. And the plant uses both positive and negative. So the positive charged ones we call cations, the negatively charged ones we call anions. And I've got nitrogen up there twice in 2 different forms. We'll find nitrogen in 2 different forms in nature that the plant can use. One of them's cation, one's anion. The cations, generally, your compost soil material, your humus, and clay type materials carry a very slight negative charge all over. So the more surface area you have in the soil, the more charges you have available. Those mild negative charges will pick up cations that have a positive charge, right? Opposites attract. The soil doesn't bond to those cations very strong because it's essentially the soil's job to give them up to the plant. But what that does is it keeps water from leaching those cations out. Cations are a lot more likely to stay attached to your soil when you pour water through. If you're flushing your plant or something like that, you'll be able to flush the anions out. The cations are going to stay attached to the soil. And so the plant, the root cells essentially have to exude different molecules of a positive or negative charge to transfer the fertilizer nutrients that we want them to eat across the cell wall. Generally, it's a hydrogen plus that the plants pour out to try and grab onto those cations. And so the hydrogen comes out, it makes a better bond for your humus, for your soil, causes the soil to release that cation, and then the root will suck it into the cell. So once we have all of the nutrients down to ions, they've made their way through the symplastic pathway into the cell, they've transferred through cells, and they're making their way towards the vascular system, which is the water delivery system to the upper parts of the plant. The xylem is the water delivery system that's bringing water and nutrients from the roots up to the upper part of the plant. Xylem's really, really interesting. It consists of cells that work in pairs. There's a tubular cell that has very little inside of it. It doesn't have the same kind of cell membrane. In fact, it doesn't even have a nucleus. It doesn't have its own DNA, but it's attached to a sister cell or a companion cell that carries the DNA, for the empty cell. And that empty cell is just a vessel to move water and nutrients. That's all it is. It's just a straw. Essentially, it's a little short section of a straw with a cell attached to it that gives it its instructions. And those straws stack on top of each other all the way up your plant, all the way up the stem. That's essentially the main part of the stem. And that xylem travels up the plant, and every time there's a branch, the xylem splits. Every time there's a leaf, the xylem splits, and it goes out to that leaf. And that xylem, every vein of it ends at stomata. Stomata are the openings in the leaf that allow CO2 to escape, allow oxygen and water vapor to escape and bring in CO2 for photosynthesis. So those stomata essentially are letting the water that's been coming up the stem, they're letting that water evaporate out of the plant as fast as it can. And so basically what the plant's doing is it's taking that water, it's using the charge to move it into the vascular system, and then it's evaporating it at the leaf as fast as it can to get that water to move up. So when the stomata evaporates a water molecule, another one moves into place. And water has this wonderful property where each molecule really wants to stick to the one behind it. So when that one molecule evaporates, it sucks another one up, and it's this giant chain of molecules all moving up to the top. And it's a river transportation system. That's really what it is. The plant is taking control of water and pushing it up to the top so that that water can carry ionic nutrients to all the parts of the plant where it needs it, especially for photosynthesis. The phloem is basically the opposite of the xylem. Phloem is collecting the sugars that are created in the fan leaves from photosynthesis, and it's bringing it down to other parts of the plant that can't create their own sugar, that don't perform photosynthesis. And that's a simplification. The phloem also has proteins, enzymes, hormones, anything else that the plant really wants to move in between cells that's not part of the nutrient coming up from the roots. It uses the phloem. And phloem uses a very, very similar mechanism to the companion cells that have an empty tube that moves fluid up. The phloem moves it down. It just uses smaller cells. It doesn't move as fast because it's not as important for reactions in the plant. This is, these pictures have been going around, the electron microscope photos of a piece of wood. What you're looking at here are those tubes, those straws, that vascular system. Now, trees have to move water maybe hundreds of feet into the air against gravity. So they have huge vascular systems. That's basically what wood is a huge vascular system that's built out of these dead cells that have solidified their cell walls, grown into a tube shape, and then died. So that their entire purpose is to be a straw to move water. This picture this is a pine tree. And trees lose their vascular system. It continually dies. Every year they will grow a new one, especially the phloem. And that's why we get rings in trees. And so you can see in this picture, in between each ring in the tree represents a different year. And the size of those transfer cells, those xylem cells, tells you about the water conditions that the tree, or the heat conditions that the tree was experiencing that year. If it needed to use a lot more water, see how much bigger those tubes are? Very cool. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about where these nutrients are going and what they are doing. Nitrogen, most important molecule that your plant's going to use. Nitrogen makes the base for amino acids. As, like I said, amino acids are built together into proteins, and proteins are used for signaling. They're used for changing the form of molecules so that they can pass through one membrane or another, or so that they can be bonded together to make a lipid or a starch or whatever the plant wants it to be. Nitrogen also makes the base for DNA and RNA. Obviously, cells won't exist if they don't have DNA. Nitrogen's essential there. And then nitrogen's also one of the molecules in the, one of the elements in the chlorophyll molecule. So really, this is pretty much every molecule in the plant. Basically, nitrogen's everywhere. Phosphorus, another big one. Phosphorus mainly is part of the energy molecule. ATP, ADP, phosphorus is the biggest part. That's how the plant releases its energy to create reactions. If it doesn't have phosphorus, it can't make ATP. And then phosphorus, again, phosphorus is in DNA and RNA. It's in every single cell in the plant. Cell can't exist without it. And then also one of your biggest users of phosphorus is phospholipids, which lipids are fats. Phosphorus in these fats is what makes up the cell membrane. The plasma is made up out of phospholipids. Potassium. Potassium is really interesting the way the plant uses it. Like I said, I did not have a clue what the plant was really doing with potassium before I studied it. Potassium is one of those cations, so it has a positive charge. And it seems largely that the plant has an easier time dealing with anions, especially inside the cell. So cations like potassium, it's a pretty strong ion, and the plant uses it to balance out those anions. Basically, when you have a negative charge and potassium comes in the area, it's going to make a change in that charge, and that's a key signaling to activate enzymes, countless activities inside the cell. Potassium really doesn't take a part of the plant very much. It's really just a molecule that the plant uses for signaling. Potassium, though, controls the amount of water and the pressure around the stomata. The stomata have guard cells that the potassium signals. When the plant has a low supply of water, for instance, the potassium will signal the guard cell to swell up and close that stoma so that it can't evaporate water anymore, right? Because those stoma are just getting rid of water as fast as they can to bring more up, to bring nutrients with it. So if the plant thinks that it's running out of water, it can close those stoma with potassium to stop the evaporation. And then another big key that potassium is a key for the ATP production, which again is your plant's energy. So it's needed in there for signaling so that ATP gets put together in the right order. Calcium, big one. Again, calcium's an cation, and it has a stronger charge, twice as strong of a charge as the potassium does. But essentially, it's used a lot of ways the same as potassium is. It's used as a signaling cation. So the plant brings it in the area of an enzyme, and its charge affects the creation of that enzyme. Sorry, I started at the bottom. Structure, number one thing, calcium's structural. It's strong, right? Calcium's rock. That's where we get it from. And then calcium plays a big part in cell division too. And there's still kind of trying to figure out exactly how calcium plays its role in cell division, but we know that it's needed. Magnesium, all these are in order of how prevalent they are in the plant and how much the plant uses them, by the way. And magnesium's the 5th most important nutrient. It makes up the center of the chlorophyll molecule. So obviously, if you have magnesium deficiency, that's why you start getting those little yellow blotches, yellow marbling in your leaf, because the cells aren't able to build those chloroplasts because they don't have a magnesium molecule to put it together. Stimulates ATP production. Again, it's the plant, the cell has so many functions, but it has a couple of basic functions: make energy, use energy, and that's where ATP comes in. And all of the nutrients that we give the plant essentially are critical for ATP production and usage. And then magnesium is also important, plays a role in the creation of DNA and RNA. Of course, is in every cell in the plant. And I think that brings us to the end of what I have for you. So I am ready to take any questions you guys might have. I know I flew through some of those things, so if you want clarification on anything, go ahead. From which system? Essentially, the stomata are just dealing with water and oxygen that's off-put from the... Yes. You're going to be looking at the exact same thing. Even through the stomata, you're still talking about the Symplastic Pathway and the apoplastic pathway. You know, that's a good question. I'm not sure if the stomata have a mechanism to filter out larger molecules to protect the plant, but I bet that they do. Amino acids are not going to be able to pass through the cell wall, but all of their components are. So all of those enzymes are going to be really important for your soil as well, and that's one of the big reactions, one of the big important things of creating all of these molecules that the cell needs to use is having the proper enzymes to get the proper reactions in our soil to create a soil environment that'll release the molecules to make it available to the root cells so that they can build enzymes and so on, et cetera. Yeah. For regulation of all kinds of enzymatic reactions. So there's a lot of them. I can't give you specific ones, but that cation needs to be in the proximity. You know, the plant deals with complex electrical charges. It's just the basis of chemistry, right? The hydrogen molecule is the smallest molecule we have, usually has a positive charge. When you mix molecules together, their charges either cancel out or they carry a smaller or a larger charge. So when you look at a molecule, it might have a positive charge on one end, a negative charge on the other. It may be completely positively charged, but that charge is going to be stronger based on the assembly of the nutrients inside the molecule or the elements inside the molecule. So things like potassium, the plant can introduce potassium alongside of, say, an enzyme or a phospholipid, and it will affect the charge just by proximity, just like putting two magnets together. That potassium can change the charge, which may cause the molecule to bond differently, or may cause it to use ATP differently, or it may change the way that ATP gets interchanged into one of the organelles. There's just an infinite amount of different molecules, enzymes, proteins, signal keys that I couldn't put it all into one session. And in fact, it's even beyond my education. You're saying putting waste plant material back into your soil to reuse it? That's a great idea. I mean, that's a closed loop system. That's what we should all be doing. We don't need to be going and buying fertilizer and introducing it to the plant and then flushing it out and putting it down the sink or letting it run into the soil and streams and whatnot. One of my friends has a technique, and a lot of this comes into soil science now. Bokashi and Grokashi are really good at breaking down plant matter and making it readily available again to the plant. One of my friends has a technique where he takes all of his fan leaves in his outdoor production, which adds up to be about a 55-gallon barrel full after he goes through and cleans everything out, once a week or so. He puts those leaves on water, lets them go anaerobic, no circulation, no oxygenation, so that those leaves will start to break down a little bit, and the enzymes and the biological activity, whether it be bacteria or fungus, yeast, whatever on the leaf, can populate in that anaerobic condition, start to break that leaf down. And then from that point, after a day or two, you introduce oxygen, you oxygenate that system, and you will pull nutrients out of those leaves like you wouldn't believe. And then oxygenating them makes it healthy again for the plant roots, because if you have unoxygenated or anaerobic material in your roots, it's deadly to them. But yeah, the cannabis plant is going to be your best source of fertilizer for a cannabis plant. I guess the right answer to that is in a whole lot of different ways. When I'm talking about cations in the soil and how they're typically bonded to the soil, one of the problems with that is it's not available to the root if it's bonded in the soil unless the root touches it. So mycorrhiza create root growth. I mean, they live with the root and they increase the size of the root, the surface area of the root and the extension of the root, so the root can come in contact with more soil areas that have those cations attached. But also the microbes can digest some of those larger molecules and break them off of the soil nutrient, make them closer to the ionic form of what the plant wants them, and feed them directly into that root cell. There's all kinds of forms of phosphorus that are going to be found in the soil that are locked up that aren't going to be available to the root even if it touches it, because they have a stronger bond than the hydrogen molecules that the root can give off to accept those nutrients. And that's where the fungi and the rhizosphere comes in. That's about the best answer I can give you. Yes, back there. It helps, but compared to the delivery system that the plant has built through the roots and the vascular tissue, there's no way you can really feed the plant through foliar feeding. But you can definitely help with deficiencies, and again, it depends on what the deficiency is, because lots of the molecules in the plant are not mobile. The plant's not going to transfer them through the cell wall to the next cell and the next cell and the next cell to get them where it needs them, or into the phloem system to get it where it needs them. The cells are going to hold on to it and use it rather than transfer it. So it really depends. If it's a simple molecule like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, yeah, you can be pretty effective at foliar feeding for a deficiency. And calcium you can. Calcium you can be somewhat effective. Calcium's one of the hardest deficiencies to fix, so I definitely suggest adding foliar if you have calcium problems. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you very much, everybody.